All right, guys. Dev. Time now is 2:02 p.m. and 39 seconds. The intent of this conversation today is to take the next logical step in our podcast journey and talk about the ambient records and how much of a part of my trip that has become over the years, where it started. Essentially, there's been a few light bulb moments for me when it came to my own musical evolution. Things as subtle as being at that Metallica show, the And Justice for All tour, and hearing the guitar being sound checked. Must have been James's guitar, and the visceral feeling of that was a light bulb moment, as was, remember, at the World's Fair in Vancouver, 1986, years before I was born. But 1986, I think it was my first outdoor concert that I had been to. I forget who it was. It might have been the Canadian band 5440. No, this was before then. But regardless, they were doing a sound check. Again, it's funny that it seemed to be the sound checks that influenced me on such a level. Maybe it was because it sung of potential. When they played the kick drum during that sound check for that band, it just did something to the air that I had never experienced before, and that was another light bulb moment. And then when ambient music became a part of my repertoire, I guess, if you want to look at it as pretentiously as that, but just when it became part of the thing that I enjoy, it was a light bulb moment for me because I never thought that those two worlds would collide. The two worlds being the side of me that liked Metallica and the side of me that really liked Emerald Webb or Kitaro or any number of these new age records, which at that point I hadn't really classified in my mind as being like an ambient type of music. It was just, let's take it back even further. I guess it was grade 6. That was my first experience with what I would come to know as ambient music. I had an English teacher. His name was Mr. Carter, I believe. I think every high school has a Mr. Carter. Anyway, as part of the exercise, he was trying to sort of elicit an emotional response from his class. He had us all put our heads down on our desk, and he played a bunch of music on a little ghetto blaster, tape recorder sort of thing. The fidelity was not great, but still you could hear it, right? And maybe I was a little older. Maybe I was about 15 or 16, and I had come back from this academic symposium, and I had fallen in love for the first time, and all these things were so ripe in my teenage hormonal mind that when he had us put our heads down on our desk and he played these series of new age music, it really was interesting, because for the most part I found a lot of it to be a little tacky, I guess. But there was one piece of music that he played. It was called Valley of the Birds by an act called Emerald Webb. That was a husband and wife team in the early 80s. I think the guy's name was Bob Stoll, and the lady's name was Cat Apple, who ended up playing on Ghost. But that song, Valley of the Birds, I don't know what it was. It was the right place at the right time. And there was something about the flute. There was something about the echo of it all. And I just fell in love with that song, and it ended up being a tape that I would go to sleep to every night. I had to order it in specially from this metaphysical bookstore down the street. And I remember going there and ordering these Emerald Webb, and that must have come from their own garage. And then when I got it, it was that one, Valley of the Birds, and an album called Soundtrek. And those two records were just the soundtrack to my youth, I guess, really, alongside King's X, Def Leppard, Judas Priest, Metallica. This is before any of the Jane's Addiction, Faith No More stuff. And I listened to those tapes so much that the fidelity of those cassettes were already fairly low, and they just kept getting lower the more I listened to it. I had this cassette deck that when the tape would get to the end, it would tighten up, and then it would go in reverse and play the other side without you having to get out of bed and flip the tape. The only problem is that in that process of the tape stretching in order to go to the other side and play again, you woke up every time. Prior to Emerald Webb, it was actually Led Zeppelin that I would go to sleep to. I would listen to the Rain song over and over. Strange in hindsight, when I listen to Led Zeppelin now, it doesn't mean the same thing to me as it did at one point. But at that time, man, Led Zeppelin was really an important band to me. And again, it got replaced by Emerald Webb. And then from there, I started to become interested in things that I had heard as a kid. I forget who in my family had played it for me. It wasn't actually a family member. It was a field trip that I went on as a kid in school, where we went to the Victoria Museum on the island, on Vancouver Island. And in there they had like a gift shop, and they were playing this music that sounded like a flute with a lot of reverb. And upon asking who it was, they said it was Paul Horn. And I ended up purchasing the record from the gift shop a few years before the Emerald Webb period. And it was Traveler was the name of that album. And again, I was just such a sucker for anything that had reverb on it. Fast forward years later, I think it was during Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing with Strapping. And I was working on a song at my apartment for that first record called The Filler. And I had always done ambient music since I was a teen. I sort of missed that whole period where I'd purchased delay units and started jamming noise music with people. Not even music, but just like putting sound effects together and having a microphone and then hitting things and then having that go through an oscillator and then turning that into a pattern and then jamming with a bunch of people. And it was like a really big part of my formative musical years, that ambient thing. And then when I was doing that filler song on Heavy's a Really Heavy Thing, for the first time I thought, well, I don't know what to put over this midsection, so I'll just take a jam that I had done separate from the strapping stuff, just an ambient thing that I had done, and I just layered it over top of the metal riff of the filler, and it was just a complete revelation for me, because it was like, your chocolate's in my peanut butter, your peanut butter's in my chocolate. These two things shouldn't exist together, yet strangely they do. And I just found that there was a whole world of possibilities that opened up. And I kept doing it. It became like a big part of the strapping aesthetic, following Heavy's a Really Heavy Thing when I went into City. Like in the first couple of bars of All Hail the New Flesh, etc., there's explosions and there's all these sounds and drones and things that are ostensibly kind of unrelated to the music. And that's just was the next stage of just trying to add these types of soundscapes to these more traditional in-your-face metal riffs and seeing what would happen. And what I found ended up happening was like a layer of depth that the frequency range in which the ambient stuff often exists, it differs from where the guitars sit, so there's room for it. I think it became, at the same time there was Ocean Machine, and there was a bit of that. I had a bit of ambient things that went on in Ocean Machine, and that was more just taking jams that I had done. Like, I think before Voices in the Fan, there's the sound of a radio that I just had a microphone through a delay box. And, there were things like that on Ocean Machine, but I still hadn't explored it to the point where it became a real integral part of what I do until Infinity, I guess. During Infinity, I think the best way... Hey, I gotta let my dog in the door here. 2 seconds. Ollie, you out here? Is Ollie out here? Oh, no, this guy is. Great. Hey. With Infinity, it became a whole new ballgame. I think every record that I do is driven in a large part by being intrigued by a new aesthetic. Whether or not that aesthetic is something as benign as a different guitar sound, as it was in Key or Teria. Both of those records were written almost completely due to the fact that I was inspired by, in the case of Teria, I was inspired by a Fender Stratocaster. And in the case of Key, I was inspired by a different Fender Stratocaster, but just a different, a clean sound with a certain type of echo. And I really enjoy going after those sounds and really getting into the minutiae of it. And maybe I just have some sort of psychological need to never be satisfied, and therefore the sounds are always evolving, but it gives me something to do, right? I think on Infinity, the aesthetic was everything happening simultaneously at the same volume, but it's like, how do you define what different dimensionality would look like? And my thought was, well, you stick with the chord structures, you stick with the basic song ideas. So the songs in general on Infinity, for example, were pretty straight ahead. Other than a couple, it's pretty linear song. It's like, here's a part, there's another part, goes back to that part, here's another part. So to have that kind of multi-dimensionality effect, if we were so bold to even assume that we got there, was have a bunch of things happening simultaneously that are not related until the chord structures changed. And then the rug that ties the room together is the vocal. That was the idea. And so I started experimenting with the ambient stuff on Infinity by doing loops, but not with a looper necessarily, but just long delays at 100% repeat, and feeding them things that were congruent with those patterns and time signatures, and then building these loops that were multi layers deep, and then highlighting certain ones based on what it was that I was trying to achieve. So what I mean by that is, whenever I hear a loop, just hear a loop. Whenever I hear .a.loop, I tend to sort of interpret it by what it makes me feel. I've realized more and more as I've gotten older, and more as my relationships have changed with people, and etc., that because I feel things in a way that surpasses my capacity to communicate it, I tend to fumble. I go from thing to thing to thing, trying to land on one of them in hopes that I've made the right decision, that that's what the problem is, right? I digress. Infinity had all these layers going on, and then I would just take the feeling that I had from each one of those layers, and then I would ride the faders according to what the particular part was saying. By doing that, I started to recognize the ways in which ambient soundscapes can really illustrate on a subconscious even level certain emotional things that the music alone, just doesn't. I mean, this is not like groundbreaking news, but it was a light bulb moment for me. So if I had made a loop that made me feel tense, and I had written a tense riff, then it standed to reason that I could merge those things, even if it meant taking the loop and then pitch shifting it or what have you, and they would be complementary. And as it turned out, in a lot of cases, that was the case. And in the beginning, it was a free-for-all. I was just putting everything on everything all the time, and then doubling it, and then taking that, trying to figure out what that loop was doing melodically, and then extrapolate that into a MIDI line, and then all of a sudden you have a different line. It's like this sort of stream of conscious, as is the case with me always, type of thinking that at that time there was no restraint, it was just full on. And I guess the next stage from that, it kept going, of course, with Physicist did a similar sort of thing as Infinity with the ambience. And then Terry got a little bit more refined because I was able to sort of exercise a degree of discernment on what goes where, as opposed to everything louder than everything else all the time. So Terry was more like everything is louder than everything else only 9 times out of 10. And on that 10 times, it's a 9 times out of 10. But hey, slow progress. And then after Terrio, we had a couple. I stripped it back with SYL and Accelerated Evolution. But then came DevLab. And DevLab was a project that I was like super proud of. It was written at the same time as often when I'm in the midst of a period in which there's a lot of emotional stimulus, like then and now, strangely, a lot of music gets written simultaneously that later on you're looking back and you're like, oh, I guess that all happened at the same time. But DevLab happened at the same time as Alien and Synkestra. And I was using it as like an exhaust port, like an air pressure release valve, so that when the neuroticism that was such a factor, such a key component into that Alien experience, it had a lot of shrapnel that just came in its wake, and a lot of that shrapnel ended up just being DevLab. The thing that I found really the most interesting about DevLab as a process, excuse me. The thing I found most interesting about DevLab as a process is that I was able to recognize that the emotional arc of a record is it's irregardless of the music. It can be static, it can be pop songs, it can be heavy metal, it can be orchestral music, it can be new age music. It's just the the emotional arc is carried through the way each one of these sections makes me feel, right? And DevLab was the first opportunity that I had to see if I could make a record with as much attention to detail as these other projects that I had done at the time. Well, time permitting. And see if I could create an emotional experience out of that. And I think that was also the first time when I started to recognize that the way that I participate in music, particularly my own music, is very different than the way that a lot of people participate in this music, my music, music in general. Not everybody, but a lot of people. And it was a bit of a wake-up call, too, because I had a couple of friends that I remember being really proud of DevLab and going, well, check it out. It starts like this. I had this crazy party where everybody was just as abstract as we could be, and it was all recorded, and I had all these components that I would put into this grab bag of things that we would put together, words or phrases, and then riff on them, and then turn them into these sort of sonic experiments. And it was so much fun. It was so freeing. And then I would take those sections, and then I would write some sort of bullshit narrative. I mean, that's what I've done all these records. That's what I've done with Moth. That's what I've done with Z2. It's what I did with, it's what we did with Casualties. It's what happened with a lot of the records. And people would say, oh, it's a concept record. And I guess my thought on that is, well, not directly in the sense of it being necessary to follow it, but in order for me to have some sort of sense of emotional closure at the end of a record, it needs to be able to introduce a theme, delve into it, and then summarize it. Like that's the whole point of it. And so if I could take that grab bag of abstract sounds that we had made and see if I could create an emotional experience with that, then that would sort of say something to me about the nature of what is important for me to focus on, I guess. If my intent is the emotional experience, then music is viewed with a different lens than my objective is a musical experience, right? Ultimately, you want it to be both. And what I found with DevLab is it really upset some friends of mine. And not only did it upset some friends of mine, overwhelmingly, people didn't participate in that emotional arc that I found to be such a key component that was like a thread between all these records, right? And so it was like confusing at first. I was like, oh, I thought it was more obvious than that. And so what I learned from it is my personal participation with the correlation between the emotional arc of music and the music itself. The importance of each one of those things, it's fluid, right? It fluctuates depending on the project, depending on the moment, depending on the circumstance or the piece of music. But really, there is some times where it's 50-50. And there's a lot of people that it's like, do I like this song? And I think what I started recognizing when I had these opportunities to work with these world-class producers, songwriters, none of which panned out to be anything other than super strange for everybody involved. But in those experiences, I recognized that it's not, somebody saying, oh, all I care about is a song, is not indicative of somebody's ability to enjoy, judge, discern taste, etc. of other people's music. It's just a preference. And by working with these people who are so high level with that, I recognize how incredibly talented you have to be in order to do that properly. So that's my, that's my caveat for that statement of it being like, well, if you don't like songs, or if you like songs, you're just simple. Man, sometimes I wish I could just write more songs. When I'm lucky enough to have a song come into my head, like whatever it is, Equinox or any of these song, Life or any of them, it's like, I'm like, oh, that's great. It's a song. Well, that's refreshing, because usually it's this sort of stream of conscious thing, which don't get me wrong, I love it, but that's me. That's where I'm at. Me rambling right now. Tell you why I'm rambling. I'm at the tail end of the Moth mix. Several thousand tracks. A lot of emotional things as well that went into the making of it, and the transitions of one life to the next, and then getting the Patreon set up, and with the strategies involved to maintain it in a cool way. All these things have just occupied all my CPU. But I was shocked ultimately about the DevLab thing, and it wasn't a judgment. This is the point I was trying to make on anybody who didn't catch my drift with that. It was more of a realization on my own part that I'm like, oh, the way I participate in this is also that. But I need to be cognizant of the fact that as a piece of music, it doesn't stand. It's sound design, if anything, right? But I really enjoyed DevLab, and it ended up just being really silly. The narrative of that, again, the narrative doesn't matter at all. It's a thing to hang my creative hat on, like the coffee thing with Ziltoid or anything. It's not that I'm compelled to write a story. It's just if I have some sort of emotional arc to follow, I can illustrate that, and I really enjoy doing that. The voice thing, singing and all the things that have happened by proxy of me just being so bullheaded about wanting to achieve these aims is just circumstantial. I never wanted to be a singer, and I think what's interesting about Moth is the vocal performance is actually really strong, I think. But my first thought with it is I was like, oh, I'm proud of that. That's great. But my second thought was just like, oh shit. Now we have to do that. Okay, so sidebar. I'll get back to it. We were on DevLab. Put a pin in it. Put a pin in it, he said inarticulately. Okay, no, let's get back to it. All right, so DevLab. Where'd we go from there? Hey, Devin here. So, to experience the full, unedited release of this episode and gain access to the deeper world of our creative imagination over here at Heavy Devi Records, you can join us at dvn.fm. This is Dev. Thanks again.